It's a small miracle that we can see Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. A series of complicated circumstances and escapes and close calls allow us to witness this horror classic. An extremely short-lived film studio called Prana Film decided to adapt Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, to film. It's a lofty ambition that has been duplicated many times since, with a variety of results. Two problems with that. Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means it takes the form of a series of letters to give it a sense of authenticity, suspending disbelief. It's the literary version of a found footage movie. This can make adaptation challenging, and it always had. This may be apocryphal, but when Francis Ford Coppola decided to make a Dracula film and others asked him why because it had been done before, he responded that it had never been done right. His film included many of these letters. The second problem with Prana creating an adaptation of Dracula is that they didn't have the film rights, and rather than pay an exorbitant amount of money, they did the next best thing. They changed the names and altered a few of the plot details. It's the silent film equivalent of making an Asylum movie, but even more flagrantly as a ripoff, barely disguising what we are seeing. There are a few deviations in the plot, but no more than any other Dracula adaptation that came later. So in addition to all the hurdles of Nosferatu existing at all, it had to survive till today, and that was no small feat. Bram Stoker's heirs sued Prana Film and won. The court ordered all copies of Nosferatu to be burned. Prana Film filed for bankruptcy. Depending on which source you believe, either a few or only one copy survived because it already reached international distribution. The film was duplicated, defying the courts. Every time we watch Nosferatu, it is an act of defiance. But that was not the last mountain Nosferatu had to climb in order to be seen today. Due to decay of film stock, approximately 90% of all American silent films made before 1929 have been lost. Nosferatu was released in 1922. Can you imagine if, in modern day, we lost, say, a 30-year period of film? Like, if for some reason 90% of all movies made from 1970 to 2000 just disappeared? Every Oscar-winning Best Picture, every blockbuster, the original Star Wars trilogy, Indiana Jones, well, the good ones anyway, every action movie, every modern classic, just gone. Vanished forever, with no copies anywhere. It's impossible now because of the internet, but that's what happened back then. This is what occurred in the early days of this art form, but Nosferatu survived. To sum up, in order for Nosferatu to exist today, it had to be brazenly created by people without the film rights, adapting from difficult source material, then refused to be burned, survive almost a century, defying common wisdom that nearly all silent films from that era were lost. This film is a miracle. If you've never seen Nosferatu, well, it's Dracula. A man named Thomas Hutter, who works in real estate, is sent to get Count Orlok to sign some papers. The Count is a vampire, and once he sails to Hutter's neck of the woods, he begins to stalk Hutter's wife, Ellen. Instead of poring over the narrative details, let's focus on the art style. Specifically, German Expressionism. Defining Expressionism can sometimes be best explained through its opposite. Expressionism is anti-realism, but not surrealism. Art that is conveyed with figurative images, expounding on emotion over grounded reality. This lends itself to a romanticized view of the world, or using the supernatural to explain the natural. This actually allows horror to fit in neatly into the Expressionist movement. It's not just a style for film, of course, but the, at the time, new medium of motion pictures created new avenues to explore our humanity through expressive art, not to mention what we fear. Early horror films in the silent era laid the bedrock upon which an entire genre was built. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, not truly the first horror film, but sometimes mistaken as such, is the story of a hypnotist who manipulates someone into committing murders. The authoritarian themes were inspired by the German population's fear of their government following World War I, and concern for where they were going as a people. This laid the groundwork for horror as a legitimate genre that can be used to enact social change or comment on society, the horrors of modern life. And what of Nosferatu's contributions to horror? Well, they are legion. Special effects, camera tricks, and practical props are necessary elements in creating a supernatural horror movie, but in the time when Nosferatu was made, they were still inventing the genre. In this scene, Just as Hutter is crossing over into Orlok's territory, the negative is flipped, and the world of light has become the world of darkness. On a purely technical level, the camera work of the film may seem rudimentary by today's standards. The camera almost always remains perfectly still and captures almost every shot in center frame, but looking closer, shots of the supernatural, like Orlok's castle, are shot in a Dutch tilt. The makeup is remarkable and remains creepy to this day. Designed by Albin Groh and performed by Max Schreck, Orlok is an exaggerated monster. His design immediately informs the audience of his villainy, but somehow the human characters around him don't question it, which may have prompted the first horror film theater shouting of, "Don't go in there!" Nosferatu also pioneered editing techniques for more complex storytelling. Director F.W. Murnau used parallel editing, multiple threads of action happening simultaneously in different locations and linked through cuts. This is commonplace now, but not as common in 1922. Nosferatu was also the beginning for a lot of horror tropes. In the film, Hutter finds a book that warns him about the supernatural. He discards it. Horror movies often show the protagonist finding a journal or ancient book that warns of evil, but almost every time, the warning is not heeded. Understanding Nosferatu goes hand in hand with understanding the time period and the setting. The film was made shortly after the end of World War I, during a time in which Germany, because of the Treaty of Versailles, had to accept the war guilt clause. That meant assuming responsibility for the war, regardless of how many other factors and nations were involved. In short, Germany's fear of outsiders, of the other, became part of their national conversation. Nosferatu is a story, quite literally, of a good man from Germany who visits a foreign land, meets a creepy foreigner with outlandish facial features, and turns out to be a monster. The vampire comes to Germany and brings a plague with him, something that was not in the original novel by Bram Stoker. If horror is about invoking pre-existing fears, then Nosferatu conjures up something the German people were already fearing and already whispering about at the time. Looking deeper at the psychological, the vampire taps into repressed sexual urges. Count Orlok, attempting to drink the blood of Ellen while she wears a white, as in virginal, nightgown, has a frightening sexual connotation. I once read an article saying that Nosferatu is not scary. Try watching it alone in a dark room. I think you may be surprised.